free to put your questions.
So first of all, questions for Iris. At some point, we would like to put this idea in the context of history of aesthetics. Because you're thinking that way, right?
Sorry?
You're thinking that way. Just it comes.
Yeah.
So what would be the proper framework for this? Maybe Kant's aesthetics, or maybe why not Aristotle's aesthetics, his poetics, or maybe Hegel's aesthetics, because he has that idea of unity of form and content, and aesthetic value or beauty of a work of art is accordance, some kind of harmony between form and content. What would be, do you have some idea already what would be proper historical framework? What is it historical, traditional aesthetics? And the second question, here is the paraphrase from your book on contemporary philosophy of poetry and Kant's aesthetics. How would you, so it was talking about, it was about novels now, but when we think about poetry, how would you connect this idea with heresy paraphrase?
Thank you. These are both
Because
excellent.
I completely share your perspective.
Thank
And
you.
because I don't have some subversive questions.
Yeah. No, these are great questions.
In
These are-
different directions.
Yeah.
What's your plan? What is your next plan?
The next slide. Thank you. No, these are actually both great questions because part of the project is actually to see how this understanding changes the way in which we tend to think about aesthetics of those art forms such as literature, for which it's not as natural to think of literature as objects of beauty, because objects of beauty following Baumgarten's tradition obviously are somehow always related to those things that we can perceptually experience, whether we can hear them, whether we can see them visually, whether we can hear the, let's say, the music. And poetry fits very nicely with this model because you can sense the beauty of poetry primarily through melodic kind of rhythmical language that poets use. Think of The Raven, for example, and examples like that. And then, of course, literature here is very problematic because when you think about literature, it doesn't seem obviously related to aesthetics understood in this Baumgartian tradition of things that appeal to the senses, or aesthetics understood as exploration of how things appear to the senses, because the only thing you have are black marks on the page, right? There's the letters themselves. Even if you're reading a novel which is typed or written or published with a very nice, how do you call
A font?
A font, yeah. It's not the font that you're responding to, it's whatever it is that it's within the book that you're responding to. So that was actually my first take into this, and this goes back to some of the issues that Lamarck raises with respect to the problems that analytic philosophers had with trying to establish literature as a form of art as opposed to critical discourse or intellectual discourse or something. So for me, when I first started with this project, it was important to show that as aestheticians, we need to develop, let's say, accounts of aesthetic experience and beauty that would be applicable to literature, because otherwise it's hard to see, it's hard to explain this, I think, notion that we all have when you're reading a book that you really like. We do tend to exclaim, this is a beautiful work, and it's hard, with the traditional Baumgartian aesthetics, it's hard to explain why that would be beautiful. And then in order to expand it, one way in which you can go, for example, is to take it more into the rationalist tradition, like Christian Wolff, for whom it doesn't seem to matter whether the object is visually available or intellectually available. You can still describe it as beautiful. And for this project, I think these are the kind of the interesting sources. How do we bring this kind of pleasure into this notion of aesthetics? And that's why I am focusing particularly on the way in which Angela Breitenbach is using Kant's theory of the harmony of our intellectual skills, so to say, and capacities, to kind of recognize that imagination and reason are in harmonious relationship when an object is at the same time aesthetically pleasing and kind of intellectually engaging. So this would be maybe this wider framework. But then, of course, it all originates with Plato and his ideas that there is something deeply problematic with the way in which language can aesthetically kind of please us. And this is
opposite position. Your position.
yeah. Now I'm
you're not going from cognitive to aesthetic,
yeah.
but other.
Yeah, this is the line that I'm now trying to establish. What really do we get from appreciating the aesthetic complexity, by which I basically mean the richness of the aesthetic experience that works of literature are kind of generating in us. And again, the thing that I think I'm focusing here is this capacity of the aesthetic power to really make us think about trying to understand that beauty. And I think that in this process of trying to understand why we feel that this is beautiful, so I'm still kind of balancing between empiricism in that sense, why my experience is so powerful, what it is that I'm really reacting on when I'm writing to this. And this is where I think the aesthetic and epistemological aspects kind of come united, and it can be very hard to bring them apart. But a good, I think, emphasis or good support for this theory also comes from the work done by people who engage with embedded aesthetics. There is this amazing scholar, very young scholar, Martin, I don't remember his last name now, Martin Kogertas, sorry, I'm probably mispronouncing that, but he was recently our guest in Rijeka, and he gave this wonderful presentation about the ways in which linguistic patterns appeal to us, not necessarily intellectually, but primarily through embodied understanding of what is happening. And that kind of got me into thinking that there may be more to our reactions to the beautiful sentences, to the beautiful language, even when it is in the process of this. And though my example in this paper was from Welbeck's novel, but the first time that I kind of got to think about these things was when I was reading the English translation of Madame Bovary. There is this description when Flaubert is trying to present her sadness, and this passage which is describing like every day she would stare in the horizon, wondering what lies ahead, whether it will be this or that and this or that, and it's kind of like 7 lines long sentence where you really feel just taken in by her sadness. And then all of a sudden you realize I'm not responding to the fact that the person is sad, because obviously you've seen that in literature many times before. But what you are responding, I think, is the manner in which this particular emotion of sadness is being conveyed to you. And I think following David now, you would say through this perspective that is given from the work. But I really think that, and this is something that you emphasized in your work when you said how the author or how the artist employs the medium. And I think with respect to language, this is all the more so because language is not so easily available as maybe visual. And this isn't to say that we can easily understand pictures. I don't think that that's the case at all. But definitely just through reading a sentence, it can be very hard to get to really appreciate that. And in that sense, when you feel this beauty, the aesthetics movement, then that kind of gets you back to really try to understand what happens. And that's where I think this cognitive element, like this is a brilliant way of describing this particular emotion. And I think that with good works of art, with great works of art, you don't only recognize the emotion, but you also recognize the depth, let's say, of the emotion, or another perspective, as David might put it, on how this emotion can be not only how this emotion can play out in a person's life. And I think that's where this recognition of the cognitive elements begin, and then you can expand that to actually see what it is that you are kind of, how does this particular work change the way in which you consider this emotion to be relevant. So in that sense, yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I do start in this talk, I do start from the aesthetics, and then I work my way up to the kind of cognitive changes.
Thank you very much. It was interesting that you mentioned mentioned Madame Bovary.
Yeah.
It's a controversial example.
Yeah.
Because there is an idea in the literature that Flaubert was ironic.
In that.
That he wasn't sympathetic equally
Yeah.
to.
I think from the literature that I read, he was really, he's not a good example for what I'm trying to do, because for him it was all about trying to master the sentences, and he really didn't care, about the topic as such, which is so surprising given that he was arrested and the whole thing that happened afterwards. He was always very clear that for him it was just exploring the capacities of linguistic creations. But again, in some other work of mine, I do try to defend this view that and this is me going against Peter Lamarck, right? When he says we don't care about these things, then I'm using Flaubert as an example. Like, this is the guy who didn't care about cognitive or ethical values, but he found himself in trial precisely for those elements. So you are absolutely right to bring Flaubert in this debate, in the sense that many people would say that the beauty of, the way this was the argument back in the day when he was on trial. His prosecutor claimed that because of the melodies of his sentences, because of the linguistic power of the book, young females all over France will be seduced by the presentation of Emma throughout her adultery. And there is this passage in Madame Bovary when the first time she cheats on her husband, and then you have like half a page long description along the lines, her eyes have never been so beautiful, she has never been so glossy, she has never sparkled so much. And obviously, someone like Plato can use this and say, obviously this is going to seduce you. Obviously you will believe that adultery is something passionate, it's something beautiful, it's something, and it will be very hard for you to resist it. So aesthetic features of language can really go, I think, both ways. So it is a problem for me on how to stop it, how to kind of make it only work with respect to cognitivism. But yeah, you're absolutely right. There's so much to consider in that domain.
But I want to say Flaubert might have been mistaken, because would it be possible to explore the capacities of language in a way that only took into account, say, how different words sounded, and didn't include, because isn't part of the capacity of language the capacity to refer to things in more or less apt or appropriate ways? So it seems like even if, so when I say mistaken, like maybe not 100% wrong, but only sort of seeing or talking about half or part of what he was doing, because if he's interested in exploring the capacities of language, wouldn't it be partly the capacities of language to present Emma's experience in a scene in a way that at least felt apt or fitting? Not to say that that captures the truth of what that event would be for anyone to experience, because there's no single experience, but it's somehow convincing or psychologically plausible that a person could experience this event in this way. It's coherent and consistent. So I don't know how you could, even if you tried something like a stream of consciousness where you had words and there was no kind of reference or meaning, it was all just about the sounds of the words, it seems like that would itself be very limited in what capacities of language you could explore. If you reduce it to pure form, then it almost isn't fully language anymore.
You're reminding me of Goodman arguing that the representational capacities of the object aren't as much property of, in this case, the artwork than its other, calling into question the division between formal and non-formal, and where we draw the line. Like there's capacity to represent, and by represent, not only denote, but also in this case, when I had a question you would be concerned when at some point you said, let me see here, about semantic density. So that semantic density as a factor in this conflict between the cognitive function and the aesthetic function. But curiously enough, for Goodman, that would be among the symptoms that would allow to explain art's cognitive power. So but really the one thing I was thinking about, there's this debate in epistemology between, we speak about the cognitive value of art, and usually there's this, because we follow the lead of the skeptics, we think about knowledge is the main cognitive value, but there's this debate between, knowledge versus understanding, especially in the epistemological literature, and what role does it play in this solving this conflict between the aesthetic and the epistemic dimensions of art. That would be my question.
That's a great question. I mean, the notion of semantic density, it comes from Berkeley, and he was referring to it with respect to trying to find the definition of literature. So literature, as opposed to other forms of writing, are all the things that are semantically dense, in the sense that you can get several different meanings. Something that I think I was trying to cover with the notion of aesthetic complexity. But it's interesting that you bring in the difference between knowledge and understanding. I've been quite engaged with this debate because I always wanted to show that there is a difference between knowing and understanding. To some people, like Timothy Williamson, he would object. It's like, no. In the end, everything is reducible to knowledge. Just
and knowledge that.
Knowledge that.
There's no such thing as knowledge, knowing how.
Yeah. But I think that's just wrong, and I do try to make a point to showing that through literature, and obviously literary writers and defenders of aesthetic cognitivism have kind of always insisted on this difference, always claiming that literature really gives us the understanding of how this is. And I think it is that such understanding can be helped through this kind of the kind of experience that you undergo in the process of reading. And maybe then this goes back to Monica's first question about the heresy of paraphrase. So for many people, if a certain text is capable of conveying information, then the messaging itself, the way in which the message is conveyed, shouldn't affect the truthfulness of that message. So you can paraphrase almost anything in almost any discourse and still get the same information to people, right? Still convey the same propositional truth. But then obviously we don't think that that works with respect to literature, because the way in which literature works as an artistic form is by producing linguistic text which is, so to say, aesthetic achievement in its own right, in the sense that you can't really change anything, because the moment you change something, reducing a word, adding a word, changing an adverb or something, you really get this different kind of experience. And I think part of that is related precisely to the way in which words come together and the way in which sentences can be kind of brought up. If you read Madame Bovary not in translation, but if you read like a shortened version of the novel, you might get this idea of she was bored in her marriage, but you're definitely not gonna, I think, experience it to the extent that you can experience if you engage with the whole novel as such, if you really go through all these different descriptions. So in that way, I think this idea of heresy of paraphrase is important for us to keep it in mind. If we are really trying to experience the aesthetic way, so to say, of an art form, then we shouldn't try to paraphrase it. We shouldn't try to. It can be a useful tool, for example, but it shouldn't become a substitute for the experience itself, I think.
Do you think that pertains to literary whole literature?
Yeah.
Not just poetry?
Yeah. If you really want to engage with the work, then you have to go through that work itself rather than through shortcuts or through. Again, it can be a useful tool. It can help students, for example. It can help people just brush up their reading skills. Because I also think it's wrong to think that just any reading is good reading. You're not going to get to the full extent of the aesthetic power of language. You won't be able to appreciate it as an artistic achievement if you are not trained in how to read properly. So for this part of training, paraphrase can be helpful, but I don't think it should ever substitute the actual work. I know that they started to do this abridged version, right? People don't want to read Moby Dick because it's like endless, or War and Peace, so they cut it down to maybe 50 or 100 pages, and that I think it's blasphemy.
Like reducing it to the plot.
Yeah,
you can see that in movie you can have in film, for instance, you have the Rashomon-like kind of films that give you this. Okay, you have basically the same set of facts. This and this and this happened, but now let's recount the story from different perspectives. And because what you're really trying to grasp there, it's not just a mere fact about the world, but you're trying to grasp the experience itself.
Yeah.
Or what is it like for us to be in this person's shoes, or someone like this, in this type of situation. That requires exactly the sort of complexity and the sort of aesthetic tools, whatever you want to call them, that are absent from propositional understanding.
Yeah.
Or whatever.
Yeah.
You're really trying to grasp the fine-grained experience.
Yeah.
And okay.
But I think what you were just saying really relates to David's talk, in the sense that any kind of abridged version or reducement to the plot will not necessarily enable you to recognize this perspective, right? It will just it will tell you what the perspective is without enabling you to
because
I think.
exactly, then just telling what the perspective is.
Yeah. Rather than enabling you to come
then it would be more like what I was saying, like works of philosophy or some natural science or history. What differentiates them from art is that they can tell an idea, they can describe it, like they can state what a feeling is, they can articulate it in that sense, but they're not sort of showing isn't quite the right word, but you know what I mean, sort of giving an experience that allows you to grasp or apprehend the perspective from the experience. I don't want to say that they just evoke or arouse, say, the experience of the feeling. So it's not just a matter of the work of art getting you to feel sad in the same way, but the work should be giving you an experience where going through that experience or participating in the experience allows you to grasp or apprehend that way of feeling it, even if you're not sort of made to feel sad or angry or whatever.
You could even say that's what marks the proper difference between an expression theory and what Collingwood would call just a craft theory of expression, in which there's this preconceived idea of what an emotion. Okay, I want to make you feel that.
Or he would say that it's it could be craft, but it might not even involve craft. I think the distinction he makes is between expressing a feeling and naming a feeling. He's saying that if the poet just names a feeling, or a novelist, because with a poet it sort of becomes ridiculous. But if a novelist just says,
it's like putting a footnote, you're making a device. Like there was this. I remember this.
Or if like J.K. Rowling just like had a sentence, Snape hates Harry. That it's too literal. It's missing out on so much. It's not false exactly, but it's not really giving you anything of importance if you just sort of name whatever it is, a feeling or a relation between people, or naming the essence of a situation.
Okay, you can work 16. So
so thank you very much for the talks. I have two questions for Professor Iris. They relate to paradigmatic cases where I think the notion of aesthetic complexity and its epistemic counterparts kind of, I don't know how they could work together, but I want to hear your opinion on that. One of them is in the novel Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace. There in the endnotes at the end of the book, there are a few endnotes that occupy more than one page, and one of them is actually just a physics essay, mechanics essay. So when I was reading that novel a few years ago, what I remembered is that those pages of the book that could work in another context just as epistemically relevant. They are science, done in a scientific way. But in the context of a whole book and just serving as an example of the work, I think one of the characters did, it also functions as an aesthetic. So when you were talking about the layers of aesthetic complexity, I was wondering where a case like that would go, like, because everything that determines the aesthetic component of a case like that, it's exterior to the actual content that's being read. Not word content is kind of fuzzy, but whatever is in the paper. That's what I mean. And another case that I remember, there's this is not from literature, it's from a song, but since it's the lyrics to the song, I guess called literature. But there's a song by a folk artist, Joanna Newsom, I don't know if you know her. She's a folk artist. And she actually has a chorus of one of her songs where the whole song is like recalling an event she and her sister had. And the chorus of the song is like her sister telling her about astronomy because she's an astrophysicist in real life. And all the things she says in the chorus are actually is false information about astronomy. She tries to explain the difference between meteorites and meteors, but from the author's songwriting expertise, it's actually being all confused. So yeah, she's not a physicist, she's not a writer or a poet. So the thing is, I always thought of this case as paradigmatic in a sense, because everything that she's saying is false information. If it's done, it would be misled and into something. But to the normal listener, it doesn't appear that way, because a normal listener doesn't know stuff like that, such as poets. And even if one does, like I actually do know the difference between all those classifications, it doesn't impact my aesthetic appreciation of the song or the poem itself. So I recognize that there's a wrong epistemic affirmation of epistemic propositions being used. I know they're wrong, I don't want to get any information out of that. But at the same time, I don't think it impacts negatively my aesthetic appreciation. So in this relation, when I'm considering layers, I don't think that the bottom layers, the epistemic content or whatever it would be, are influencing the bigger picture of just an aesthetic appreciation of a poem. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Thank you so much. Both questions are amazing. Thank you. Really, really excellent insights. Vitor did suggest that you have hard questions, but this is really like, wow. So let me start with the second one, because it's an extremely interesting case. So for any kind of defenses of aesthetic cognitivism, there is always going to be the problem of errors in literary works or in lyrics in this sense. So whether it is the kind of examples that you give, usually famous example is the way in which Ibsen, there is a novel, The Ghost, not novel, but a play by Ibsen where the main character has syphilis. But then the problem is the whole kind of causal way as to how this syphilis, how this person got affected is actually biologically wrong. So for many people, that's a crucial example of how literature can get you to believe things which are wrong. And obviously this is a problem. Now, your question is brilliant in forcing me to explain what has happened to the aesthetic value once that not only do I find mistakes, but when these mistakes are kind of, the description of these mistakes is one element at least, or one segment of the aesthetic value and the aesthetic experience. So for me, and this is maybe a cheap way out, but for me, I always, when I defend aesthetic cognitivism, I always make sure to point out that, like other forms of discourse, including science, literature is not protected in that sense. So there's nothing that guarantees that you ain't gonna find mistakes. So if you kind of, in order to really, let's say, learn from literature, like in order to learn from other sources of knowledge, like the testimony of other people, even the experts, you should also, do the work yourself, in the sense that it is always better if you can check your facts before you actually claim, okay, now I have learned something. And this is, of course, it's not a good answer, because first of all, many of us don't really do it. I mean, I don't think that anyone really goes and checks whether the things that he or she thinks have learned from fiction are true. So it's probably not the best way, but it's still kind of, as my answer, it's always like, okay, but we are not infallible also with respect to other sources of knowledge. But we are not giving up science because every now and then there is a faulty scientific report, right? So in that respect, literature may be a bit more problematic, but in the big scale of things, I don't think it's entirely false all the time. But then what I want to suggest even further, and I don't know whether this works with your example because I'm not familiar with it, but it definitely works with Ibsen. If you're thinking about the kind of thematical issues that he is exploring, such as with respect to him, it is the dysfunctional family dynamics. It doesn't really matter. The biology of syphilis doesn't really matter for what it is that, for the insight that he is giving us into the kind of dysfunctional family and the ways in which families can fall apart. Now, I hope that this can also be applied to your example in the sense that, whatever the, let's say, thematic level is being developed can still work, even though this. Another good example of this is if you read The Lord of the Flies. There is one element where they need to set fire and then they use the glasses from one person. But then someone who has a lot of knowledge with respect to physics realized that I think he was short-sighted and then these kind of glasses could never actually start a fire or vice versa. But that really doesn't change the fact that you still learn a lot about group psychology and the way in which people tend to become hostile to one another from that film or from that book. So that would be my general line of response. Now, with respect to the first question, that's also a great example. I read The Infinite Jest years ago, so I don't remember all the details, but there is a similar book, again, by Welbeck, where he is describing quite a lot about genetics and physics and biology and genetics. And these sentences, these even whole paragraphs and whole pages, when you read them out, they really sound and they really seem like you're reading a scientific work. I tend to give this to my students and then I ask them, do you think this is a literary? When we do the definition of literature, I usually give them this example. Would you ever say that this is literature? And then, how does this contribute to, well, first of all, sometimes, and I think you can recognize this even with respect to certain scientists, some people just write beautifully. For example, if you read philosopher Philip Kitcher's work, you can just see it's not only great philosophy, it's also beautiful sentences. So there could be sciencey writers who also write beautifully. But with respect to your question, how does that relate to the overall? I think what matters here is to see well, first of all, I think it would be very important that the writer doesn't go too much with that the scientific element doesn't really take over, because in that way it can be hard to maintain the interest of the reader. But if the writer finds a good way to balance these sorts of, let's say, sentences, more scientific sentences, not to be too oppressive towards the reader or towards the work itself, I think it can still function beautifully with respect to the thematic level. You need, as a reader, you need this information in order to better appreciate what it is that is happening to the writers. And from what I remember, I didn't think that these parts, I actually liked The Infinite Jest, and I do like this work by Welbeck even better than Submission. And I personally am not, in any way distracted by that. So it could also be related to whether or not you think the relevant question here is being addressed throughout these kinds of descriptions. But thank you.
I think the same thing to do.
Oh.
Yeah, in regards to Infinite Jest, I really do think that I remember thinking when I was reading those passages, like I think most of the readers will skip
this part, yeah.
So far out of the rest of the book, it doesn't influence it in any way. So yeah, I completely agree. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So maybe one question to lean on to the previous ones. So going to epistemology a bit, because you mentioned that you bring into it a lot. So I'm wondering about the types of cognitive evidence content can have in general. So then just then to see how literature fits into, or fictional content in general fits into the work that's done by scientists or other kinds of theoreticians, because it seems, for one, that this model of knowledge that is operated with by Carey or Olson or others tend to impoverish view of how it is that we learn about the world and what it is that we know about it. So I'm thinking, just at the top of my head, you can say that a piece of content can have cognitive value if it teaches you some sort of general facts, what were like encyclopedias, for instance, or textbooks in different scientific areas. Then you can get a lot of cognitive value out of learning how to infer between different facts, how to connect different pieces of knowledge, how to systematize it. But then you have a third kind of value, for instance, and here I'm thinking about how Kant viewed power judgment. We know general facts, but you have individual content in front of you, and you need to subsume it under some concept. How do you do it? And the concepts don't tell you how to do it. You need specific faculty which you cannot learn, that you can hone. So could it be that this kind of fictional content teaches you, let me call it recognitional knowledge, but I don't know if it, this knowledge has a different kind of name. But the knowledge by which you recognize what something is. So you learn about human psychology, for instance, mass psychology, and then hearing a piece of news, you say, oh, well, this is like that. And that can teach you more than atomic psychology books, for instance. So one thing I'm thinking is like a thought experiment, analogous to what Mary didn't know. So you put a person in a room with all the books they can have from all the different disciplines, and they can learn everything that there is to know. But then go out into the world, meet a person, talk to them. Do you learn something new? I suppose yes. Oh, so this is the kind of thing that I was reading about, but didn't have any instances of. And what I was asking mostly was, in epistemology, what kind of framework would apply to this kind of thinking, and if it would be helpful for aesthetics?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. I do think that when it comes to explaining what we learn from literature, I think that like people like Gordon Graham, who was among the first, as far as I know, or Dorothy Walsh, one of those first analytic philosophers who tried to engage with this question, they actually had a much more developed epistemic framework than epistemologists at the time. It was with the work of Jonathan Quanglin, who developed all these different layers of epistemic achievements and aims and goals, that these two branches in a way came together. But I think that you are absolutely right in the sense that through reading different kinds of works, we do kind of manage to develop maybe these perceptual recognitional capacities to really pinpoint those experiences that are not necessarily acknowledged outside of that. And you can think here, for example, of the way in which some of the writers were very quick to recognize or to describe different forms of experience that were never actually recognized at the time as, in some way different or problematic, like whether it is the female experience or stuff like that. So in that sense, it was through this kind of depictions that a form of practice that was very common in the world took this particular shape and enabled also others then to recognize it. And there is a wonderful book by Derek Attridge on the ways in which literature enables us to recognize those that are other to us, that we just don't know how to deal with them and how to recognize them. So maybe that would be a kind of epistemic work that literature can do, and that epistemology, the traditional epistemology focused only on propositional knowledge, kind of can't really succeed. But I think this is also with respect to how David was suggesting that a work of art can show us different forms of experience through presenting them through a particular perspective. It is only now that people like Elizabeth Kamp have started to do some serious work on perspective And it seems that having a certain perspective in your mind, it's really crucial to how you, for example, relate to other people or how you appreciate or understand your experience. Now, and I was wondering actually about what would you say about that. The problem with that then is that what certainty do we have that the authors themselves are giving us the right perspective on this? So I think it always goes back to the problem of epistemic reliability. You might even say sincerity of the writers themselves. So I don't know if you would.
What would the right or wrong?
Oh, so you
perspective
would
be
definitely
in this
reject
case?
it as a position.
Well, no, the question of how can you know or be certain whether the writer is giving you the right perspective. I don't know that there's a single right perspective because there isn't maybe not every single person. It's possible that 2 or 3 or more different, like some set of people would have what you could say is the same perspective or the same experience of something. The same, as I'm talking about as perspective as a way of feeling or a way of sort of synthesizing the manifold and sort of making sense of the experience. Yeah, multiple people could do that. I don't know that there will be a different perspective in this sense for every individual person. But there will be many different perspectives that different people or different sets of people will take on the same event or experiential manifold or whatever you want to call it, the same object or landscape. But I mean, there's that cliche of the, like you pick some number of painters, they're all equally skilled and you sit them down in front of a landscape and they'll all paint a different picture of it. Like none of their pictures will be identical because they're picking up different features of the landscape or whatever. Some are more prominent than others or more salient. So yeah, I would reject the idea that for any thing or event or phenomenon, like any intentional object in the broad sense, that there is a right perspective you could take on it. So with this question of
does this also go
so
for the
with-
scientific perspectives?
I don't know if those are perspectives in the sense that I'm using the word
Okay.
in science. Probably perspectives in this sense is involved in some way in science. I'm not sure, I haven't thought about how it would be, and I don't know if I know enough about scientific practice to know how it would be. But, so it's possible that it's involved, but I don't think it's as essential or as omnipresent. Like I don't think all of science would involve this. But, so I think the question of, instead of asking the question like how do you know if the author is getting the perspective right, I think that's easier to ask if it's sort of relativized to a character, and then it's a sort of a matter of consistency of the character. Does it fit with everything else that's been established or set up about the character that, say, Emma Bovary responds in this way or has this thought at this moment to this particular event that she's experiencing? There might be some things that Flaubert could have written her thinking that would just not make sense based on how the character is developed. There could be things that might be surprising that you wouldn't think of would make sense, but suddenly they sort of fit together. Ian Forster, in a non-fiction book he wrote about the art of the novel called Aspects of the Novel, which is really good. I think we've talked about it and I recommended it to you.
Could be.
And you haven't read it obviously yet. But he talks about flat and round characters. And this isn't a normative distinction. He says almost all or all of the characters in Dickens are flat, but that's fine because that makes sense for the kinds of books Dickens writes. You want flat characters who will be, in a way, one note. Like they're recognizable, they'll always behave in similar ways, they're not going to be wildly different from scene to scene or whatever. But he says round characters, his definition of a round character would be a character where they can do something, or the author can describe them as thinking something. It doesn't have to be an act. Like they can do or say something in a moment in the story where it is genuinely surprising based on everything you know about the character, but it seems to fit. So it almost like shifts your gestalt awareness of the character, so that becomes new. You realize, oh, the character is actually like this, and this is a way of fitting this new piece of information about them in with everything else you learned, and you sort of rearrange it and rebalance it, and it can make sense or it can be consistent. So I would say that it's not a matter of getting the perspective right, in that the perspective is the single correct one. But if there's anything like truthfulness of what I'm calling a perspective, it would be something like coherence, consistency, psychological plausibility. You might have a fictional character that's internally consistent, but is just not plausible that anyone would be that way or respond in it. Like, it's just not a coherent way of, as I said, like taking things, right? That is ultimately going to be coherent and
But so,
plausible.
if I get you right, you are not really bothered with the usual problems that the cognitivists have when they are asked to explain what gives epistemic reliability to the artists.
No, because with the very narrow thing that they mean by like epistemic or cognitive value, what they count as knowledge, what they seem to count as reliability, in the scope of that very narrow set of terms, I might be inclined to agree with them that literature or art isn't a reliable source of knowledge if you take knowledge and reliability to mean what they seem to take it to mean. But I just think that their mistake is in being far too narrow in what counts as both knowledge or cognitive value and maybe reliability. So, like, in a sense, I think Stolnitz is right for what he's talking about. But I just think he's like limited in scope.
Is there a place here for, okay, when you're asked, okay, give me the goods, what do we learn from art? What's the right perspective? Isn't like in the background a form of consequentialism about epistemology, like deliver me the goods, that good that is independent from the process. But we are speaking of something completely different, a form of good that's dependent on the process, which is more akin to a virtue theoretical perspective. And this could mark a difference within epistemology itself between a consequentialist perspective or a consequentialist framework to deal with epistemic value and a virtue theoretical approach. And here the difference could lie exactly here and not in. Here we are wasting time, like trying to defend art using the framework of, for instance, the Stolnitz sort of objection. And but regarding what the sort of thing you're talking about, we agree with you, but that's not the point. So.
Yeah, the problem always with those kinds of answers is that it is simply too abstract. It kind of is too subjective from one reader to the other, and at the same time it is too abstract. It cannot be measured. It cannot be, you might be mistaken, or this is what Greg Carey now has this whole book where he's very, aggressively attacking the idea of learning from. Like, if you can't really measure it, if you can't put it in words, if you can't really, how are you going to prove that you have actually learned anything if you can't even speak about it? If all you have to rely on is your subjective feeling that something now is cognitively changed within you, for some people that is a mistake. But I absolutely agree with both of you that that's not necessarily the best way in how we should talk about the epistemic value that literature gives us. It's just that these kinds of, let's say, Stolnitzian echoes are so strong to this day that it's hard to get rid of them. So maybe we do need a completely different epistemic actually framework.
Yeah,
and I wondered about this, what I thought of during your talk. Although as an epistemic framework, it seems very basic and probably out of date. I don't know that epistemologists talk about it anymore, and if you mention it to them, they'll be familiar with it, but they might sort of think, oh, that's too basic, or that's like first year undergraduate level. But the distinction that Bertrand Russell talks a lot about, I don't think he introduced the distinction, knowledge by acquaintance and knowledge by description. So it seems that the skeptics about art having cognitive value, the Stolnitz and people who sort of accept his presuppositions, it's almost like in order for art to be a source of epistemic or cognitive value, it's almost like they're expecting it to give knowledge by description, right? Stating in language a fact, where there's a proposition and the content of the proposition is true because it matches onto the world. And so knowledge by description a lot of times would be given in language. Someone tells you something or you read something in an encyclopedia or whatever, and that would count as knowledge by description. But yeah, with the distinction Russell makes between that and knowledge by acquaintance, and how in some ways knowledge by description is derivative from or is less stable or it's thinner than knowledge by acquaintance. I'm wondering if, it seems like if literature and other arts give knowledge, as you said, part of it is the process, or it's going through the experience, and that's a key part of it, that in a way, the knowledge, or if you don't want to use the word knowledge, understanding, whatever it is or is more like knowledge by acquaintance, as Russell described it. And then, what might be confusing people about literature is that literature is using language, and the other ways that we get knowledge from language are knowledge by description. So it's expecting, because it's linguistic, to give knowledge by description. If it's not doing that, or can do it, but it's not a reliable source of it, because something can be true, but it's in a fictional context, so how do you know it's true without going outside of that? Maybe they're just expecting the wrong thing, and maybe fiction is giving us knowledge by acquaintance, but obviously not like acquaintance with a person or a bit of nature or an event that's actually happening.
It's like literature is the experience machine in Nozick's thing.
Something like that.
Something like that.
Yeah.
But it's not that
Okay, so it's not giving us acquaintance with, if we read Madame Bovary, it's not giving us an acquaintance with a person who is having an affair. So we can't sort of ask her what she thinks and learn directly from a real source. But why wouldn't it be giving us not just a description, but a kind of acquaintance with the way someone who is having an affair could plausibly think? And it doesn't have to be the way that anyone who's having an affair will think. It's like, if you have an affair, you'll think this. But as long as it's plausible, as long as it's how someone who's going through this experience could think or could make sense of it, why is that not enough to learn something about humans and human psychology and human emotions and human relation to kinds of situations from? Why could that not be something we could learn from, in the sense that if we, as you said, sorry, I don't know your name, but like you read, sorry?
Me, what?
Oh, no. Andrea, okay. Yeah. No, what Andrea, I think it was you said, like reading about something online or in the news or whatever, if you have a psychological theory, you can say, oh, that's an example of this psychological phenomenon. Gives you a way to understand. It could be wrong or right, but like you can learn from that. Why couldn't you learn in a very similar way? Not what someone having an affair will think. So, sorry to do this much that. If I find out that Iris is sneaking off at lunch and cheating on her husband Anton, who's running to the ocean, I said, "Oh, I've read Madame Bovary. I know exactly what you're thinking." No, that's like obviously that's false. But maybe having read Madame Bovary gives me like a foot in the door. I know something she might be thinking, and then I could think like, well, what else I know about Iris? Is that likely what she is thinking? Well, no, because she's different from Madame Bovary in these ways, and it's like a starting point or a foot in the door, as I've said.
It's like what James Young says about illustrative representation. It's the kind of thing, so like that kind of person.
Yeah.
Thinking that kind of situation. So it's not like a factual statement about like the fox and the grape. It's not about factual statements about actual foxes and actual grapes. It's the kind of thing that a certain kind of person, namely those who belittle the things they cannot have. So it gives an insight into that mind.
Yeah, so you can say we've become, but through reading literature or engaging with the fiction, even though in some sense, our perceptual experience is looking at ink on a page or whatever, and not meeting people and literally witnessing events. Maybe that's enough to say that through doing that, you become acquainted with this like type of, with a psychological type or a type of reaction or a type of response.
Sure.
Yeah. So like maybe, I don't know. I have no idea. I'm guessing that. I guess just because of the ahistorical tendencies of analytic philosophy, partly, that Russell talked about knowledge by acquaintance and description over 100 years ago. I'm guessing that modern epistemologists wouldn't really place too much weight in that or talk about it. But I don't know that that's no reason to bring it
Actually,
up.
they would.
If it-
Williamson just gave a talk about recognition.
Okay.
In just a few weeks ago in Belgrade, he's trying to develop the framework of recognition, and Timothy Williams.
Oh,
And I asked him about the difference between recognition and acquaintance, because thinking something along the similar lines. So there might be that epistemologists are catching up with, but yeah, I don't know.
that's what they do. Is they just like find a new term for something and say exactly what. Even no, Russell didn't do it. Gettier. The Gettier problem is just describing something that was in Bertrand Russell. So I guess that's probably more common because in order to publish something that seems new, probably there isn't a lot that's genuinely new. But if enough people have forgotten about it and you put it in new language so it seems new, maybe that's enough to get it published.
So we have,
You can.
add something to the same lines. So we have here you mentioned knowledge that, propositional knowledge, and knowledge how, and here with acquaintance principle and distinction between acquaintance and description. And I agree with your view. So we can just add that knowledge, how it feels like or what it's like. It's knowledge what it's
Knowledge
like.
what? Right? Yeah.
What it's like. So I'm thinking in the context of your talk, some types of knowledge would be, I think, more aesthetically demanding than another. In the terms of craft, literary craft, it is harder to give that perspective of how it feels like than to maybe propositional knowledge is less demanding than others. If you
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you, and I think it's a great mystery of how people like Flaubert or how people like Edith Wharton, another author that I absolutely adore because of the things that she does with language. And I think it's a mystery how and I would imagine with visual artists or with dance or someone, you mentioned dance before.
I have the least knowledge of how dance works.
No, but you mentioned that Merleau-Ponty was.
Yeah.
So I think
I just
with
can't
any-
speak to any example.
With any art form, I think, how do these people manage? How did Beethoven manage to do what he did? I think that's just a mystery. We can explore creativity, we can search for its biological foundings, psychological, but, and maybe this is, as you know, one of the reasons why I just love Kant so much is that I think within Kant's theory, there is this idea that art is nature-given gift to humanity, which is of course self-maintaining, because with Kant you need one poet in order to raise the spirit of another, and so it goes. But it is, I think, in the function of humanity's moral and ethical and epistemic progress. So, within Kantian framework that works. I wonder, without Kant, why did this amazing gift ever develop within humanity? I don't know. So I don't think we will, at least I'm not capable of understanding, just how brilliant Edith Wharton has had to be to put those sentences. And you are free to work with your own example, whether it is David Wallace, whoever your favorite author is. I think it's just this, and this is why I dislike those people who discuss aesthetic cognitivism, trying to understand why these authors, how can they have knowledge? I don't want to go into this mystical, they're just born that way, or, they just see the truth and they have the skills to I don't have this element of explanation. I just think that it's a wonderful gift to humanity, however it is that it came about. And we may not ever be able to understand the actual skills that people like Beethoven or Wharton, and again, use your own example.
Well, I think in some cases, and it's not mystical, I think there is an answer to how artists can get knowledge as artists. And it's because the kind of attention that working with the medium and doing that well involves them paying might, like at the same time, be a kind of close attention to something they're writing about. So if a novelist writes a character in a way that is inconsistent or isn't psychologically plausible, that psychology couldn't be a real person, even if there's no actual person who has thought those same things. In some sense, that's not just, it might be an epistemic flaw in that sense that they're failing to sort of capture or express how this person would think of the situation, but it's an aesthetic flaw because, and I think they would, if they're honest and a skilled novelist, they would realize that what they've written isn't getting the character right, and they would go back and do it again. And so the same with someone drawing or painting an object, just the close attention to that object and its perceptual or visual properties, that painting it and trying to get the painting right involves. I think it's that process of working with the medium that can give them, that's how they get knowledge of what they're
I think you are describing Matthew
making art
Curon's theory of creativity, and I really think it's the best that we have. But again, I'm not, I read a lot of biography of literary poets and writers, and they always emphasize this particular element. But I always wonder whether that's the whole story, just constant efforts to make it better. Probably it is. I believe in skills. I believe in practice. But sometimes when I read something that I really like, it's just wow, it's mind blowing. Like, how can this person write in this particular way? I mean, I was reading and listening to tons of Houellebecq's novel when I was working on this, and interviews and stuff like that. And he also said, I've been reading since the moment I got out of my mother's womb. I started to read. So obviously it is good. I think that the explanation will be along these lines, but I'm still wondering whether that's the whole story. Maybe I'm being,
Yeah, I want to say that, I guess a way of putting what I was saying is that artistic media, in a sense, are almost like prosthetic devices that help us see or apprehend the world better by focusing attention through the medium. So it's not, it's not just a matter of the amount of effort that an artist puts into getting it right, but it's that specifically the medium itself gives them a way to get it right. And even outside of fiction, I think even Timothy Williamson probably would have to agree that writing, just the medium of nonfiction writing, like writing philosophy, and even I guess analytic philosophy as a style, the kind of medium of writing philosophy, of organizing your thoughts, just using that medium and writing in that medium and revising and writing, it helps him clarify his thoughts or figure out what he thinks and gets closer to the truth. So I think artistic media can do that. Maybe not for the same kinds of knowledge or the same kind of facts or content that philosophy or science or history can do.
Then how do you explain that there are, take Timothy Williamson, who is at the peak of analytic philosophy, but then take also Philip Kitcher, and they literally hate one another with respect to everything that they stand for. So, and I guess you can have the same problem with respect to writers, right? You can have two brilliant authors, both of whom have really mastered the art of writing, but the things that they write about and the insights that you might get from them are completely opposite. This is the problem for at least very narrowly understood aesthetic cognitivism.
Is that, going back to the earlier question and issue from 20 minutes ago, is that only a problem if we assume that there is only one thing that will count as getting it right. Or
Well,
one
I was
true
wondering with respect to you,
approach
because
of
you just mentioned that as a philosopher is working through the techne of writing analytic paper, it is getting him closer to the truth. So I am wondering, in that scenario, how do you explain Timothy versus Kitcher, or take any other great philosopher? Surely has his opponents or her opponents. So just
Well, I mean, yeah, that's maybe getting closer. They could both be getting closer and be in different places. I think Timothy Williamson probably thinks he has gotten at the truth.
oh yeah, he surely does.
But
This is like in Heraclitus, right? You have the guy
Yeah,
on top of the
yeah.
hill. And
Can
the
you
guy,
please not insert?
here, and it says the way going up and the way going down, they are one and the same
Yeah.
way, just the perspective is different.
Yeah.
yeah, so no, like, and there can be, like, obviously not every, like, people can get it wrong. But I don't know that in order for some or many things to be wrong, that there has to be only one thing that counts as getting it right. Like, I think there can be degrees of success, degrees of truth. I guess, in a sense, I'm like ultimately more of a pragmatist in my own personal orientation, and I would think that nobody's ever going to get it right. You can only be approaching something that is more correct, but you're never going to. And I guess Kant is, like, you can't get at the thing in itself. Like, always, like, truth in that sense is always going to be out of reach.
I like when people confirm Kant in the end of their
There was someone, a professor at the school when I was doing my master's in philosophy, said something that was really funny. I don't know if I can get, like, the exact wording. I don't know if I can, but he said something like, and he was, like, known, like, he was one of the Kantians. He said something like I don't know if Kant was right about everything, but I don't think he was wrong either.
That's a great way to stop a conversation.
Maybe reality is such that you cannot get the right perspective. Like, it's just too rich for that. And if you consider like what someone like Nelson Goodman is doing with the Sentiment of the Aesthetic, is really working towards that perspective. Like his ontological approach to the world it matches his aesthetics in this way. There is no Lenzing perspective. Like if you emphasize this, and this, you get something out of that slice of reality. If you emphasize it differently, you get, and it's not like these two different mutually hating authors. No one is getting it exclusively right and the other is wrong.
Well, that actually depends. I mean, I totally agree with you, but the problem there is there's such a strong tradition of trying to show that particular authors really wrote their work in order to convince you of particular perspective. So you can think, going back to pro-slavery versus anti-slavery, you can think about female rights, you can think about immigrant rights, you can think about the way in which, let's say, queer issues came into literature. There was always this idea that this particular author or group of authors really wanted to convince the readership that, let's say, the treatment of slaves was wrong, or of women, or, pick your subject, right? So these sorts of, I'm against it, I have to say. I don't like these kinds of interpretations, but it's quite often that you hear this with respect to literature, that they were trying, or any other artist, I think, that they were trying to push forward a particular perspective on something, and that really takes...
Although I don't... So on the definition that I hinted at wanting to develop, but obviously haven't developed yet, I think I'd be inclined to not count those as examples of art in a sort of strict sense of using the term art, because it seems they're taking a, if you want to call it a perspective, they're taking a perspective, although, yeah, it's a cognitive perspective, a perspective on an issue. I guess that's one of the many things that I want to
So, like, not even
count as, but
that's Matthew
well,
Kieran's example when he
no,
defends
maybe that's
perspective.
a bit different, but like a purely didactic work, where someone writes, say, a novel or short story in order to convince readers that slavery is wrong, or to, I don't know if there were works justifying it, probably at the time, I just don't know about them now. But I don't, like, if that's what they're doing, I wouldn't count that as a work of art, because they're not, like, again, like a work of philosophy or science or history, they could be stating a perspective, but I don't know that it would be using the medium to express a perspective, because on my understanding of expression, it's the post-romantic notion of expression that I talked about. There has to be some elements of like discovery or creation through the process of working with the medium in order for it to count as an expression rather than just a statement. So in this case, if you start already knowing the position you want to convince the reader of, then, and going to Collingwood, it's a form of what you call craft, right? You start with a known end in mind, and then you think about how I can use the medium and the techniques of the medium as means to achieve that end that you already have in the beginning. And I would want to say that it can involve perspective. It can state a perspective, but it's not expressing a perspective, and it's not creating a new perspective. Where I think art is giving, in at least some minimal way, a new perspective, or showing like a new way we can take things, shedding a new, even a slightly new light on things.
I'm not sure I agree, because take Edith Wharton, for example. I think she's a great novelist, but she, at least from the biographies that I read, she was really, I probably shouldn't say pissed at the society, but she was really angry at all the ways in which people were being mistreated. And throughout all of her novels, there was always a very clear moral vision, I think, that she was hoping that people would get. But on your view, that wouldn't count as art, right?
Well, I guess it depends on how she did it. If she made a list of all the things she was angry about and the problems she thought were wrong, and then like deliberately decide, I'm going to make a character that exemplifies this problem or whatever. If that's all she did, and through the process of writing it, she herself gained learned nothing and gained no new insight or awareness into why these things are wrong, then no, maybe I would say that it's
So it is like
a
the
kind of
ignorant
a political
artist that
use
you
of
are, that you
no.
are presupposing.
not ignorant, but like I would think that also, even if you start out with a goal like, yeah, I'm angry at the way capitalism robs people of their dignity. It's not like having that sentence at the beginning, it's like no longer makes it art because you know that, but it's like in the process of writing a story. And again, I think this goes back to the details of like working with the medium. In the process of wanting to write a story that shows how capitalism, what did I say, doesn't respect people's dignity or something like that. But getting the details right and how you describe it, if you're expressing a perspective on how capitalism can be bad in this way, then I think part of that will be furthering what you think through the process of writing the book. It's like the author discovers something new about how, even if it's in line with the original intuition of the starting point, the author has to learn through the process of writing the book how capitalism can be bad in some way, and be articulating that and making other people aware of this new take on it. If the author is just starting from this idea that capitalism is bad, that's, again, like maybe it's using the novel form to make political point as a kind of propaganda, using the term neutrally in the good or bad sense.
That's really interesting.
Because I don't know, so why I wouldn't call that art in a strict sense of art is that I don't know that those works can be bearers of all the sorts of value that we tend to think that art can be, that make art valuable or important, socially or culturally. Like I think that could be a novel, but the kinds of value it would have would not be much different from a non-fictional political tract. It could still have value of some sort, but I just don't know. No, I kind of want to make developing or creating and discovering as you create it some even just slight variation, slightly new perspective on something. I kind of want to make that necessary for something to count as art in a strict sense.
So your idea of the epistemic position of the author or the artist then is that he or she is no more knowledgeable with respect to this process of learning and discovering than her audience is. It would be more platonic then, maybe, in a sense that,
I mean, they could be a bit more knowledgeable than the audience.
but still she shouldn't come from
They
the
shouldn't have
perspective
full
of.
finished knowledge. No, they should.
So
The
What about
final-
religious poetry, like George Manley Hopkins? What would
I think
his
some of
poetry
the,
not count as art?
I would imagine that some of the religious poets, like Hopkins or John Donne, or people would have again engaged in writing poetry as a kind of device, or I use the term prosthetic, maybe that's not the best word, like as a kind of device or a way of deepening their religious sensibility, rather than having a religious sensibility fully formed and then just like telling other people about it.
there must be a surplus that's somehow accounted by
Yeah,
the
yeah.
heuristic. Like the what you do to get there is
Mm-hmm.
not just external to what you get. So again, it's the consequentialist versus the
Mm-hmm.
virtue framework. Because okay, I know where I'm going. What maximizes this? So as opposed to no, I still don't know exactly because what I do to get there will be part
Yeah.
of it.
It's great because when
Yeah.
Robert Frost describes his own poetry, it really sounds like what you are describing. I start from this vague idea of what it is that I want to do, and then by the time I'm done with my composition, I feel that I have really understood it. So it's a wonderful way
And the idea might, like for some people, there are different works. The idea might not be vague. Like someone could start with a fairly precise idea, but through the course of working in the medium, the end result is probably going to differ in some ways from even the fairly precise idea they
There's
started with.
enough to be from vagueness into
Yeah.
precision, but there's some sort of transformation there.
But if it's didactic all the way, then does it change the fact that it's less available for it, or that it causes more cognitive harm? For instance, I want to teach people about the harms of communism, and then I proceed to do it, and then I find different ways to do it. I discover different reasons for it along the way, but it still is didactic. It has nothing more to it than what I intended to begin with.
Maybe the discovering of different reasons for doing it might count. If you just discover a different way,
But in the end, for the reader, it's
Yeah.
just an instructional manual of what
Sure.
to keep away from, for instance.
if it's only that, it could still have some value. But like it could have cognitive value, because obviously no one's saying that art is the only thing that has cognitive value. I guess the paradigm would be non-fictional text of a certain thing as having cognitive value. And then the question is whether art can do the same or measure up. So that might be like fine, and it might still we want to still count as a novel. But I just think that there are reasons for using the term art in a strict sense, or speaking philosophically, a bit more strictly. So even if something isn't art in my sense, it doesn't mean that it's worthless or wouldn't have value. I think that there would be some kinds of value that only art in my sense could have. And that might be tied, maybe not exclusively, but that might be tied ultimately to this idea that what I'm describing will always involve bringing some new perspective into the world. Like creating, maybe not new knowledge, but the basis for new knowledge. And something that is purely didactic wouldn't really be adding anything new in that sense. So like there would be at least some kind of value that it would lack, but it might have other value.
I have to say, and you are going to hate me for this, but the way he just described artistic creation, it fits word by word. Vince Gilligan's discussion, if you watched
Gilligan's
Breaking
Island?
Bad. No, I'm saying it because
Gilligan?
David doesn't believe that television aesthetics is
No.
that television is like an art.
No,
So
I
you
said
changed your mind? But
No, I
basically,
always said it could be, but I don't. Like
Well,
the
Vince
examples you talk about, like
Gilligan-
Law and Order, that's like
Vince Gilligan really,
I
when
think-
he's describing the process of creating Breaking Bad, he often says, like, I started with this idea that what could, and this might be interesting for your PhD, what could make a person break bad to the extent that he becomes a moral monster. And then he was describing these experiences in the writing room, and it really is like, let's try to do this, let's try to do that, let's see whether this fits with Walt's character, let's see whether this fits. So it really is a kind of process that you are describing now. So no, I'm just saying that whether your view would then imply that any media, that we shouldn't divide art between high and low with respect to the medium used, but rather with the process through which it's used.
I agree with that, what you last said, that any medium, maybe not even like things that traditionally or typically count as artistic medium. Like, I wouldn't want to preclude the possibility that someone could rearrange the chairs in this room in a way that expresses, like develops and expresses and articulates a new perspective. Maybe that would be an installation, like a kind of sculptural installation. So, like using the chair, like I think anything in principle, as long as it could function as a way to develop and articulate an expression, could be an artistic medium. So there's no reason that television
You can just take the Carroll approach, radical approach to medium, because medium serves style, not the other way around. So if it depends on it's an empirical question.
Yeah.
Can I arrange these chairs in a way that I don't know? We have to try.
Right.
So if you are a medium essentialist, you're going to say no. There are restrictions. We have these ideas of what a medium is, and there are a priori restrictions on what you can successfully do that are set by those restrictions.
Yeah, I wouldn't agree with that. But then with what you said, so with Breaking Bad, I haven't seen the show. So I don't know like if it is or not, if I would want to count it as that. But I would say that this idea of like the process of discovery and not knowing the outcome would be a necessary but not a sufficient condition. Because there are lots of things that, like an architect designing a house. Well, I think architecture can count it, but some houses are not works of architectural art, but still, the architect in the process of designing it could discover. So I want to say that's a necessary but not a sufficient condition. Like a carpenter can explore in their off time, like new designs for a table, but that doesn't necessarily express and articulate a perspective. But it still could be a kind of discovery or fit the creation discovery model. But yeah, so that's not sufficient. So just because the writer of Breaking Bad said that, like that's not enough to tell me whether the show would count as a work of art in the television medium or not.
So I'm just thinking about this. When Goodman uses this criterion to distinguish artistic architecture from non-artistic architecture, and he focuses that on exemplification, would you call that an instance? Oh no, that's just everything which is about anything as a perspective. That doesn't mean it expresses perspective. So would you say, what am I trying to ask? Does Goodman's criterion suit you, or is still not sufficient? Like you have to add something to it.
Yeah, I don't know if the exemplification would always be the expression of a perspective.
Maybe sometimes yes, sometimes not.
Because like his example that he uses to explain the idea of exemplification, the paint sample. The paint sample exemplifies the color of that brand of paint or whatever, but that doesn't express anything. It's not saying anything about the paint. So there would have to be maybe some aboutness there that gets close to this like phenomenological idea of intentionality. Some aboutness.
Maybe through that contested idea of metaphorical exemplification, because in his paper about how buildings mean, it's all about
maybe that
metaphorical exemplification. And then his case study is not the tissue sample, but what is the name of the church? He uses an example you remember. That Baroque church in Germany. That isn't.
I don't know. Yeah, so that might count. I would have to go back and look at what he says about that. It seems like that metaphorical exemplification would more plausibly count, because then that would seem at least, and I want to make the conditions, like if you meet them minimally enough, like that's enough to count as art. Like I don't want to have art be some exclusive thing necessarily, but I also want to give a principled way of distinguishing art from non-art that would make sense. So Yeah, that might. Maybe every instance of metaphorical exemplification would be enough to count on my criteria, because at least that seems to be showing how, like, a medium can be used to be about something. Maybe that's enough. Yeah.
Viersenheiling, and it's about the vault and an idea of rhythm, which cannot be said literally of.
Oh yeah, yeah.
That's sort of an example.
Questions, but we can continue this conversation tomorrow or today after tomorrow.
Yeah.
The first one is because it's a little bit complicated, and you mentioned the difference between sharing perspective or expressing perspective on one side and stating perspective on the other, and I think that is very important here, especially if we want to broaden this perspective of your talk in the context of interpretation, for example, and that debate between actual proponents of actual intentionalism on one side and hypothetical intentionalists on the other side. So, is author somehow in epistemologically privileged position? What is the relation between the meaning, true meaning of an artwork as an expression of a perspective and semantic intention of an author? Something along this line. The first question, the second question about your definition, you mentioned three conditions, right? The first is that the work has to be created by artists and expressed and experienced by some audience. That is the first. Second is an aesthetic value, right? It has an aesthetic value.
Or it could bear aesthetic
texture, yes, it could be.
Yeah.
Exactly. And the third condition, open texture, you mentioned Boris Light. So I'm wondering, what is the logical status of your definition? Are there some individually necessary and jointly sufficient conditions for the application of the concept of artwork, understood like expression of a perspective, or what is exactly? But you mentioned something, and the third condition, open actually. It was contrary.
Oh, okay. So the second, yeah.
And the third one is, you mentioned also propaganda art, but in your presentation you said that artworks understood as expression of the perspective that it has, not just cognitive value, but social and moral and political value, right? What about sharing perspective in The Triumph of the Will by Lenford Riefenstahl? And those values, social and political values. So negative examples, so to say.
Yeah.
So something, just, and we can continue tomorrow.
Yeah, I can try to say something quickly about all three, and then we can continue tomorrow. So the second question, that's the easiest to say something quickly about. I guess this is the work in progress part. I guess I'm still trying to figure out what I want to sort of pin down as individually necessary and generally sufficient conditions to make it all work logically. So I don't really know exactly what they can be. Like I have some things that I would want to count as.
Conceptual structure, maybe family resemblance structure, or the concept, or
Yeah, I don't. Like family resemblance structure, I don't know. I think that's too loose for what I would want. I think there are ways of giving necessary and sufficient conditions that are still open. Because what will satisfy those necessary and sufficient conditions in any particular instance is not sort of limited in advance by the conditions. So I think that there are ways of, and that's how to get around
it's
Leixig's problem.
essentially adequate in the moment, right? But it's inadequate. And
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. So yeah, I don't really have a full set worked out yet, but I guess that's part of what I'm looking at. The third question, I mean, there's a lot to say about the third question, like how works like Triumph of the Will or whatever, like a work that genuinely expresses a perspective on an issue where we think the perspective is morally or politically flawed, how that can have a positive moral or political value in some sense. I think that they still can, it's just going to be different sense. So I think that, and in a particular case, saying exactly how that case has a positive particular value, it could be tricky to work out exactly, but I would say that, so if what Leni Riefenstahl is doing is successfully articulating what it was like to see Hitler as a positive figure, as the savior of Germany. If it's expressing or articulating this way of taking, like a positive way of taking Nazism as a social movement in the conditions of the time, then I would say that it has political value in that, like even as a cautionary tale, it is giving us insight, and it could also count as, like this, at the same time, the same thing could count as cognitive or political value if it's giving us insight into how fascism can be appealing or seductive. It doesn't mean that we have to accept it as working as propaganda for us. So the fact that it did work on people in that way, like it helped convince some people, that would be like a negative practical political value. But I want to say that it can have this other positive political value. They might also be practical in that different sense, like serving as a cautionary tale rather than serving to motivate the Hitler Youth or people to join up.
We just assume that for it to have, the author must be successful in some of her aims, like convincing you of her moral vision of Hitler.
Yeah, I wouldn't say
But
that those
it
aims.
doesn't. I often find that one of the reasons I love Italy is how they preserve the past. Like here's the fascist architecture.
Oh yeah, the thing
Always
is,
glory. Because my sensitivity is the opposite of, but I'm really pissed at people who want to destroy these things.
yeah, tearing
Because-
down the statues, because if they assume that like having the statue up will somehow make people admire the figure, that's a silly assumption to make.
That's a silly assumption, but really, okay, I go to Rome, I go to the Mussolini Stadium, that complex, sports complex. I'm looking at that. And there's something about fascism, and the workings of the fascism in the human life that I grasp by being there. I'm not going to grasp that already. Sorry, I'm not going to do that by reading the book. It's not enough. So, I need that understanding. So it's not about this idea that, okay, but you cannot have this here because then you're going to be convinced and you're going to become a fascist. That's really stupid. Sorry.
Yeah, and how it can have moral value.
Yeah.
Like, I think there are still ways to.
It gives you an understanding. Okay, it's against the intention. Okay, you have this. You said the novel by Ulrich. It says all these things about the world is going to be taken over by the Muslim, blah 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 blah. And then he's talking the part where he's talking about, and then these guys are given wives, and then to be seduced into the. Okay, anti-intentionalist stance about perspective. Maybe the perspective he's expressing is not the perspective he thinks he is expressing. Okay, this is okay. I'm pulling being Goodmanian about perspective. This sort of perspectivism. Maybe he's just reconceptualizing something already present in his society and his experience. Okay, you all have that. It's called lovers. You see, and. How do you already think about relationships between men and women? And then we're projecting that into something you see as alien, blah, blah, blah. And I understand that, I can see that, and that at the same time I'm doing it, I'm reading it, I'm discovering something. It's not just applying, so I'm reading. Okay, that's it. Okay. If you quit that intentionalist stance and the idea that the author must be successful in her project and endeavor of convincing you. No, it doesn't. The value of the work of art, qua work of art, It doesn't have to be tied to that.
Yeah, I agree. That's mistaking the value of the work qua expression with its functional value qua propaganda or whatever.
Yeah.
And yeah, with the more, like, I think that there is something morally valuable about an honest and accurate expression of, like, making public, putting it out there, of a morally flawed view, saying what it is like to think in a way that you might even call evil. I think that can be morally good for some reason. Like, it could exemplify certain virtues, like honesty and courage, not to self-censor or hold back because it's uncomfortable. I think that in some ways, having honest expressions of, and accurate expressions of what people genuinely think or feel is better to have available for people to be able to develop morally themselves in response, even if sometimes it will go wrong. And there will be some people who are sort of seduced by this or go along with it. I still think that there is a kind of moral value of knowing accurately what it's like to think in immoral ways or feel in immoral ways. And the first question is also something I'm working out a little bit, but I can maybe say a bit more to it than the necessary and specific conditions one, about whether the author is necessarily in a privileged position to know or to say what the work expresses, or sort of the authority on what the work means and expresses, the like actual versus hypothetical intentionalism. Because I would say that in many, so I don't even know if the artist or the author fully knows everything about their own work. Part of the process of discovery is the artists themselves can still like see new things in the work that they have done. I think in most cases, though, the author will at least like know what. This may be a vague way of putting it. Like, they'll know what game they were playing in making the work. Like, they'll know what they'll know roughly the perspective they developed in my terms. They might not know all the entailments and the consequences of it, or all of the ways that different things could look from taking up that perspective. But I think they would roughly know what the work is doing. And so they might not be like a necessary authority, but they're going to be more likely to be able to say that certain interpretations of their work are just plain wrong, because they're sort of mistaking the work as doing something other than what the author was doing with it. Like, I think Robert Frost, maybe everyone can say this, but I think Robert Frost is in a clear position to definitively say that his poem, Stopping by the Woods on a Snowy Evening, the figure in that poem was not Santa Claus. We might strongly suspect that it wasn't, or it couldn't have been. But I think if Robert Frost says, no, that's not what I like, that is authoritative, that's accurate. But I do think that, I want to make it possible that people could almost accidentally create a work of art without realizing it. So I'm thinking about how it would be possible. And I think intuitively it seems like it should be possible in at least some cases for someone to make a work where the work, like what they've done with the medium and the work, does express a coherent perspective. And the audience can see that in the work. Where the artist, for some mental block, for some reason, sort of fails to pick up on what they've done. And yeah, I think I want to make that possible. So maybe it's a matter of making the definition so that something is a work of art if the work expresses, or if the work articulates a coherent and new perspective. And there could be other conditions as well. So, and in most cases, because the work is not just, I don't think of the work of art as just like the object that is the end result of the artist's process of making it. I want to say that part of the work itself, ontologically, is the process and like what we might call the finished product as part of the process, because the process would be different if it didn't end up in this finished product. But like that painting on the wall, whatever it is, if it's a work of art or not, I would want to say that just taking that physical painting as it is now, abstracted from what led up to it and its development, as the work of art that you're talking about is a mistake. That seeing it as the artist's doing, seeing it as the kind of result and carrying the trace still of all the artist's creative decisions as in the process of painting it. Like that's the work. Part of the work is the work that the artist did, the artist is doing. So in some ways that is compatible with, maybe it sort of falls under David Davies' definition of art as performance. I think my view is very sympathetic, but I want to say, okay, what kinds of performances count as art? Because not everything that's a performance is art. So ontologically, artworks might be the artist's performance, but their performance of expressing in the medium perspective. So yeah.
Oh, serendipitously, you answered one of the two questions I had specifically, because I was going to ask, when you say Duchamp doing that gesture may count as a work of art, that doesn't mean that anyone signing your rental is a work of art. So this reminded me, okay, David Davies's action token theory, ontology of artworks. But since you answered that one, I might as well, just to finish, because when you were, I was intrigued, ontologically intrigued. So by the Glenn Gould playing with Bach.
Oh yeah.
And so there are two works here, but I was thinking, okay, because of what Gould adds to the performance, like the performance expresses a perspective on the work. But you have recent discussions, like for instance, Julian Dawes' book about authenticity. He argues that isn't it a central goal in the whole tradition of classical music for performance, that the performance should do this. And so this is how we conceptualize this as interpretive authenticity, the idea of interpretive authenticity. Like you gotta provide, the performance must be illuminating about the artwork, and different performances will perform this work differently. And so if you take this approach, that the tradition itself requires this of the performer, you have an argument here for not, instead of just two works, of one work, and Glenn Gould is just doing the performance work of providing interpretive authenticity, rather than just playing the notes. And then he does, because it's Glenn Gould, he does this extra thing, which counts as a work of art. But you can look at it like, no, you're just being a good performer, is interpretively authentic, like, and he adequately fulfills the expectations of the tradition. So this could be an argument for this on the work, really.
No, I guess why I would want to say that there are two works, like that one performance counts as two works, is that in that case there seem to be two people who count as artists, Bach and Glenn Gould, whereas the sort of mechanical, straightforward playing of the notes of a Bach score that adds nothing, it's not really interpretive, it's not shedding any light on the song. It seems like in that case the performer isn't really an artist in the strict sense, the creative artist, like they're nominally like a musician, but Bach is an artist there. So if there are two artists, then you could probably differentiate two works, even though it's the same performance.
Or this is just an occasion to bring something else from Collingwood, which is a cooperation between the artist.
Yeah, I was just thinking of
yes,
like
okay.
not hybrid, but like
You
but
need
like
to be an
opera,
artist.
how opera collaborative.
Yeah, you need to be an artist to perform that role. The Glenn Gould role regarding the Bach's piece. So yeah, because actually this would be a third question, but I'm not going to like the role of the cooperation, because it seems to introduce also this social dimension. We've been talking about this knowledge, the social dimension of knowledge, social epistemology, and this seems to be the Collingwoodian idea of the cooperation seems to introduce this social element.
Yeah, that would fit. I want to say so. At least I think hopefully everyone would agree that there's something artistically different from the Glenn Gould type performance of Bach and the like mechanical, faithful but lifeless performance of Bach. And so then the question becomes, what is artistically different about it? I mean, Julian Dodd might say that Glenn Gould is, he probably would say Glenn Gould is just bringing something new out of what was already in the score. But then Dodd doesn't think that Bach created the score. It's like an eternal sound structure that even Bach discovered. So like Glenn Gould and Bach both are discovering things that are in this eternal sound structure. But yeah, that's unsatisfying. I think I'm more happy saying that when Bach wrote the score, he created a work of art. Glenn Gould's performance is still a performance of that musical work. So hearing it counts as hearing the work Bach did, but hearing it also counts as hearing the artistic work that Glenn Gould is doing and performing it. And maybe there's something like aspect perception where you could sort of shift and like hear Bach or hear Gould as you're listening to it.
Ontologically, this could get really complicated. I can say, hey, there's one musical work, but there's more than one artwork musically. Thank you.